Hello and welcome to another webinar by the Community Services Teaching section at TAFE Digital. Today our webinar is on the New South Wales Mandatory Reporter Guide, or the MRG. My name is Carla Napolitano and I am a Community Services teacher at TAFE Digital. My experience with and knowledge of the MRG has come from over 20 years' experience at the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice, previously known as FACS. As future or current workers in the community services industry in New South Wales, it's important for you to know that in any work that you do with children or young people in New South Wales, you are a mandatory reporter. This presentation will cover what it means to be a mandatory reporter in New South Wales, and we will cover things like legal responsibilities of mandatory reporters and the New South Wales Children and Young Persons Care and Protection Act 1998, which we will refer to as the Act. We will then move on to the definition of risk of significant harm, or ROSH for short, which is a threshold for reporting to the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice. We will go through the definition of what risk of significant harm is, and we will discuss how the MRG can help you navigate this definition, which can be complex. Next, we will delve into the MRG itself. We will look at what it is, how it helps mandatory reporters report, and where to access it. We will use a case study to demonstrate the use of the MRG and specifically discuss the MRG decision trees. We will look at what they are, how to select the correct decision tree, how to answer the questions within the MRG, and how to properly use the definitions to help you. We'll be using a case study about Elena and Harry, which I'm sure those of you who are doing the Certificate 4 in Community Services will recognise. At the end of the presentation, there will be a list of resources with links that you can access in the PDF version of this presentation, which will also be available to you. Let's start with the legal responsibilities that we have as mandatory reporters in New South Wales. Our legal responsibilities come from the New South Wales Children and Young Persons Care and Protection Act 1998, or the Act, as I've previously mentioned. This is the primary child protection legislation in New South Wales. Section 27 of the Act describes the responsibilities of mandatory reporters in New South Wales, and in the next slide we're going to look more closely at who mandatory reporters are. As per the Act, mandatory reporters are required to make a report to the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice if, in the course of your professional work or other paid employment with children, you have reasonable grounds to suspect that a child is at risk of significant harm and those grounds arise during the course of your work. There are two important things to remember here. If you work with children and you have reasonable grounds to suspect that a child is at risk of significant harm because of something you know, have seen yourself, or have been told about a child or their parent, then you are mandated by law, by the Act, to report to the New South Wales Child Protection Helpline at the Department of Communities and Justice in New South Wales. Other people who are mandated to report also include people who hold a management position in an organisation who are responsible for the direct supervision for the provision of services to children. Additionally, and most recently in 2016, this also includes a person in religious ministry or a person providing religious-based activities to children. It also includes any other private health or allied health professionals, for example, psychologists, occupational therapists, speech pathologists, physiotherapists, and any others who provide a service to children. In February 2019, this definition of a mandatory reporter was also extended to include other state and territory child protection agencies. So what should be reported if you're a mandatory reporter? The legislation states that you must report to the New South Wales Child Protection Helpline if you have a suspicion on reasonable grounds obtained during the course of your work that a child is at risk of significant harm because of the presence to a significant extent or circumstances of neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, risk of harm through exposure to domestic violence, and failure to engage with services after a prenatal report. Now that's a lot to remember if you're a mandatory reporter. So that's where the MRG comes in. More on that a little bit later. You'll remember from the last slide that as a mandatory reporter, you should report a child if you think they're at risk of significant harm, because the presence of the different types of abuse, such as neglect, physical, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, exposure to domestic violence, is present. But what does risk of significant harm means? As a mandatory reporter, you need to determine if the concerns you have about a child meet the ROSH threshold before you consider making a report to the Child Protection Helpline. The definition of ROSH is quite a complex one. It is a definition based on a policy, and as you'll see in the next slide, it's a tricky one to remember. This is why the MRG was developed. The MRG helps you, as a mandatory reporter, determine if your concerns meet the reporting threshold. One of the great things about the MRG is that you don't need to remember what the policy definition of ROSH, or risk of significant harm, is. You just need to remember to use the MRG, and the MRG will take the information you input, and based on research around risk and vulnerability and likelihood of future harm to children, the age of the child, it will determine if you have met the threshold for reporting. I want to show you the full definition of risk of significant harm, or ROSH, so that you can see the layers of information it requires from you as a mandatory reporter, which thankfully the MRG helps you with. The definition states that ROSH means that a child or young person is at risk of significant harm if the circumstances that are causing concern for their safety, welfare, or well-being are present to a significant extent. This means that the concern is sufficiently serious to warrant a response by a statutory authority such as the Department of Communities and Justice, DCJ, or New South Wales Police, irrespective of a family's consent. The definition goes on to say that what is significant is not minor or trivial and may reasonably be expected to produce a substantial and demonstrably adverse impact on the child or young person's safety, welfare, or well-being, or in the case of an unborn child, after the child's birth. The significance of the harm to the child can result from a single act or omission, or from an accumulation of these. It's certainly a mouthful, and one that mandatory reporters are unlikely to remember in the course of their everyday work. So enter the MRG. The MRG is a structured decision-making tool, and what this means is that it's a tool that helps you make decisions based on the quality of the information that you put into it. It also means that it's a tool that's based on evidence and research. It helps mandatory reporters determine if their concerns about a child meet the threshold for reporting to DCJ. The MRG is structured in a question and answer format, which helps you answer yes or no to each question. Depending on whether you answer yes or no to a question, you are then taken down another path to another question. You continue this until you reach what's called the MRG decision, which is the end point that tells you whether your concerns have met the threshold for ROSH, for risk of significant harm, and therefore for reporting to the Child Protection Helpline. We're going to go through the MRG live shortly, but I wanted to show you how easy it is to access. The MRG is an online tool which is available via a direct link, which you can see here, to the Child Story Reporter page. It's also available by simply searching through Google. You can Google MRG and it's usually the first result you get. There are some important things to remember about the online MRG. When you go to the MRG page, you don't need a login or username to use the MRG. You only need to log in when you make a report to the New South Wales Child Protection Helpline. So if you remember from before, when the concerns that you input into the MRG result in ROSH, then they've met the threshold for a risk of significant harm report. This is when you need to make a report via the MRG through what's called the Child Story Reporter portal, which sends the report electronically to the Child Protection Helpline. This means that because you don't need a login or username to open up and use the MRG, anyone can use it, and it's particularly useful for you to practice using the tool without having to enter any specific identifying information about any child you are concerned about. As I mentioned, you will only need to provide the specific identifying details of a child and the concerns that you have when you meet the threshold and you need to go through to make the e-report for the child. The only thing you need to be clear about are the concerns that you have for that child if you want to practice on the MRG. And please do use it to practice, to think about the kinds of concerns that meet the threshold and to think about what this means for either your current or future work with children and families. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to go through the MRG live shortly using a case study. This slide is to show you that the MRG is a pretty simple tool to use with just 4 basic steps. The first decision that you need to make, step 1, is to decide which MRG decision tree best matches the issue or concern that you're most worried about in terms of the child that you want to report. There is a great guide within the MRG to help you select the correct decision tree if you're not sure, and we'll see this in the next slide. Once you've decided which decision tree you'll use, you select it. The next step is to simply start answering the questions in the MRG about the concerns for the child that you have with the information that you have. It's really important at this point to remember to always carefully and thoroughly read the definitions before answering yes or no to each of the questions in the MRG. More on that later. The final step is that you continue to answer questions in this same way until you reach the MRG decision or the MRG outcome. This is where the MRG will provide you with a decision about whether the information you've put in about the child that you're concerned about meets the threshold for reporting to the Child Protection Helpline or not. Remember, as I said in the last slide, the first decision that you need to make in the MRG is which decision tree to use. The MRG has a total of 8 decision trees you can choose from. There are 5 decision trees that you can select when you have concerns about a child having experienced either physical abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, psychological harm, or they're a danger to themselves or others. The final 3 decision trees are to be used when you have concerns about the adult parent or carer of a child and what they may have done or not done that causes you concern for the child. These decision trees are the relinquishing care, carer concern, and unborn child trees. I won't go into too much detail now for each type of abuse, as you can see all of that detail in the guide to choosing a decision tree. The important thing to remember is that there are specific trees for when you suspect that a child has already been harmed or is at risk of being harmed, which are the first 5 trees, and that there is another set of trees for when you have concerns about the way that an adult is behaving towards a child or something that the adult is doing, which may result in a risk of significant harm to the child based on one of the 5 abuse types. It's a really important distinction to make, and we'll hear more about this when we go through the case study. The other thing to note is that of the 8 decision trees, 3 of these have what's called subtrees. This means that the main tree is branched off into other types of more specific concerns. You can see here that the neglect, the sexual abuse, and the carer concern trees all have subtrees. These open up once you've selected the main tree. The neglect decision tree branches off into specific types of neglect, such as supervisory neglect, physical neglect, medical neglect, emotional neglect, and educational neglect. The sexual abuse tree branches into 3 subtrees, one for children who have allegedly been sexually abused. Children are children from the age of 0 up to just under the age of 16. The next tree is for young people who have allegedly been sexually abused. Young people in the legislation are classed as children who are over the age of 16 years but under the age of 18. The final subtree in the sexual abuse main tree is for children who display problematic sexual behaviour towards others. Finally, the carer concern tree branches off into 3 different types of carer concerns that we might have. Concerns about the carer's substance abuse, their mental health, or domestic violence in the home. and we'll do more on this when we go through the case study. Some really important things to remember. The definitions in the MRG are the most important part of the tool. It's really important to remember that when you are going through the definitions of the MRG and you're being asked about a family situation or a child situation, you should only consider the information that you know, the information that you have in front of you, or the information that somebody has told you, or the information that you have seen. If you don't know something about a child or about the concerns or about the impacts that the concerns might have had on a child, it's really important that you don't assume that information. Because if you assume that information, that's going to mean that you're going to answer the questions in the MRG incorrectly based on these assumptions rather than the facts of the situation. Another really important thing to remember about the MRG, as I've mentioned, is when you're going through the definitions, what you will see is that the definitions have either an and or an or part to the definition. What this means is that if the definition has an and in it, it means that you have to agree to more than one part of that definition. So it's this and that in order to say yes. If, on the other hand, a definition is an or definition, what this means is that you need to agree to either one or the other part of the definition in order to answer yes. The final important thing to remember about the MRG is that you must read all of the definition. You need to read right to the full stop before deciding whether your answer is yes or no. Now, some of the definitions in the MRG are quite long, and it can be really tempting to stop reading once you've found what you're looking for. But it's really important that you continue to read right until the full stop at the end of the definition before you decide whether your answer to that question is going to be yes or no. This is a diagram that shows you the structure of the MRG questions overall, and you can see from this why the MRG questions are called decision trees. Each question that you answer then branches off onto another question depending on whether you've answered yes or no to the first question. So question 1, yes or no, will take you to another question which will give you a yes or no possible response, which will take you to another question. You continue this until you reach the termination point or a recommended action. This is often called the MRG outcome or the MRG decision. So just remember, when you're answering these questions in the MRG, consider what you already know, read the definition for each question carefully, and if you don't have the information to the answer, then it's not a yes, it's a no. This slide shows you what the front page of the MRG looks like once you've gone in through either the specific link I showed you earlier or through a Google search for the MRG. There are a few different parts to the front page of the MRG, but it's pretty simply set out. At the top left-hand corner of the page, you'll see the Start MRG button, and this is where you click to start. You'll also see at the top there's a green highlighted bar which at the moment is highlighted on decision tree. This means that we're at the part of the tree where we have to select what tree we're going to use. This bar will move progressively to the right once you progress through the MRG, and you'll see this once we move through the case study live on the MRG shortly. So you'll remember that the first decision that you need to make is that you need to decide which decision tree to use. What you'll see circled in the middle of the page is the link to where you can find the information on the guide to selecting a tree. This link provides you with really comprehensive information about when to select each decision tree depending on the concerns that you have. So just to recap, we have the 8 decision trees in the MRG. If you have concerns that a child has already experienced harm, you should consider what type of harm from the first 5 decision trees. If, on the other hand, you don't know whether a child has already experienced harm, but you do have some concerns about the parent or carer's actions or inactions, you should select one of the final 3 decision trees. Let's try this with a case study. So many of you will be familiar with this case study, albeit in a slightly different form from the Community Services Certificate 4 Cluster 1 Skills Assessment. What we're going to do is have a read through the case study, and whilst we're reading through the case study, I'd like you to start to think about what are some concerns that you might have for this child and potentially what decision tree you might be looking at to start the MRG on. The case study is that you are working at Indigo Community Services as a family caseworker. One of the regular service users, Elena, drops in to get some assistance with food vouchers. Elena has her 8-year-old son, Harry, with her. While you are talking to Elena about how things have been going, you notice that she appears to be affected by drugs, as she's very slow in her movements and speech and appears to keep losing track of what she's saying and drifting off. Whilst you're talking with her, her eyes close momentarily and her head nods down. This happens a few times during your conversation, and when Elena comes to, she seems disoriented. You know that Elena has a history of using opioids, which are strong pain medications. As a family caseworker, you are a mandatory reporter, and you start to think about the impact that Elena's possible drug use is having on Harry. After Elena and Harry leave, you speak with your manager and she decides that you should use the MRG to check to see if your concerns about Elena's possible drug use and the impact it might be having on Harry is something that you need to report to the New South Wales Child Protection Helpline. So having read the case study, what we're going to do now is go live to the MRG, and I'm going to show you on screen how to go through the MRG, make the decision about the tree to use, answer some of the questions, and come to the end result or the MRG decision. Before we go to the live MRG, I just want to take a little bit of time to remind you of the steps that you need to take. Firstly, we're going to be deciding which tree you're going to use that best matches the issue that you're concerned about. Remember to use the guide to selecting a decision tree if you're not sure. You've got 8 decision trees to choose from. You need to select the tree that best matches your concern about Harry. So you need to be asking yourself these questions. What's your concern about Harry? Has Harry experienced physical abuse or neglect or sexual abuse or psychological harm, or is he a danger to himself or others? What you might come to realise from the information in the case study is that we don't have any of this information to indicate that Harry has experienced any of these types of abuse. We then need to look at the concerns that we might have about any adult parents or carers in relation to the child. In this case for Harry, we need to look at the carer concern tree because we do have some concerns about Elena and her drug use. And as you'll remember from the subtrees available within the carer concern tree, we do have a substance abuse subtree that we can select. This slide shows you the whole front page of the MRG with the 8 different decision trees. It's quite small, but you'll see it when we go live. What you'll see is that the carer concern tree down the bottom left of the screen is highlighted. The carer concern tree, as you'll see in the top right of the screen, should be used when you have concerns about a carer's substance abuse, mental health, or where there are concerns about domestic violence in the home. So where you think that a child or a young person is significantly affected by carer concerns around substance abuse, mental health, or domestic violence, remember to always click down to read the definitions carefully before you answer the question. So think about things like, what concerns do you have about Elena? Do the concerns fit any of the carer concern subtrees? And we've already said that potentially we're looking at the substance abuse tree because we're concerned about her drug use. After you carefully read the definitions in terms of which carer concern tree to use, you click next and we start the MRG in terms of the specific questions about the concerns in the carer concern tree about Elena's substance abuse. Once you've selected the correct carer concern subtree, which we have identified is the substance abuse tree, you'll then go to step 3 of the MRG, which is where you'll start answering the questions. Remembering always to carefully and thoroughly read the definitions before you decide whether the answer is yes or no. You'll keep going with the questions until you reach the MRG decision or the outcome. This is step 4. So now we're going to test this live on the MRG. So we're going to start on a Google page so that you can see how easy it is to find the MRG. So we're simply going to type in MRG in the Google search box and you'll see that it's the first result that comes up. Click on the MRG for the Child Story Reporter. This is the front page of the MRG as I've shown you. You're going to see the 8 decision trees, and when you hover over each of the decision trees it will highlight it in blue. To select the decision tree, you click on it. But remember I said there is a guide to selecting the decision tree. So if you're not sure just from the information that's here, you can go into the guide to selecting a decision tree and it takes you into a really good table. Use this decision tree when. Okay, so if we're considering using the carer concern tree, I'm just going to make this a bit bigger. What we'll see that you use the carer concern tree if you have information that the child or young person is significantly affected by carer concerns such as substance abuse, mental health or domestic violence. So if they've already experienced abuse or neglect, then use that decision tree first. So we're concerned that Harry might be significantly affected by mum's drug use. So that gives us the okay to go back and start the MRG again. And we're going to go down and select the carer concern tree. Okay, so we're selecting the tree to get into it. So as you can see, as I've mentioned before, there are 3 different types of carer concerns and you need to choose the type of carer concern that you have. We have said that potentially it's substance abuse because mental health doesn't fit and domestic violence doesn't fit. But we're going to follow the requirements and we are going to look at the definitions. Okay, so in this case, we would select the substance abuse tree if, for example, we have a child or young person that discloses a significant substance abuse by a parent or carer. We don't have that because Harry hasn't disclosed. We would also select this when we observe a parent or carer to be significantly impaired by substance abuse, and that's something that we have seen. You could also select this when there's inappropriate parent-carer substance use which is reported to you by a third party. Well, that's not the case because we saw it. And you would also select this when a child is born and there's evidence that the child was exposed to alcohol or drugs, and that's not the case here. So for us, we can safely say that we are selecting the substance abuse tree because we've observed that the parent is significantly impaired by substance abuse. Okay, we're selecting the substance abuse tree, clicking next. This will take you into the next question. So this question is asking about the impact of the parent's substance abuse. So the question that we're asked first is, does the parent or carer's substance abuse impact, or is it likely to impact her ability to meet the child's needs, cause significant harm, and or does the child's behaviour indicate the impact of substance abuse? Now that's a really big question, okay? So we're going to absolutely have to look at the definition before we select yes or no. Now this definition, I'm just scrolling down, is really long, okay? But I'm going to go through it with you. It's really important to not cut corners and just assume that you know the answer to this, because if you select yes here, it's going to take you down a particular path. It's going to open up other questions that follow on from yes. If you select no, it's going to select different questions that follow on from no, and you will end up with different outcomes. So in this case, and you will recognise this case study if you are doing the Certificate 4, particularly in the Cluster 1 skills assessment, the names have been changed, but the situation is very similar. So in this case, what we'll see is that there's 2 parts to it. We answer yes if we can meet this part of the definition, and we also have to meet one of the following. Now the following are the ones that are underlined. So that's 1, that's 2, That's 3, and there's 4. Okay, so we're starting at the first one. Answer yes if you reasonably suspect that a parent is abusing alcohol or other drugs to the extent that it's having a negative impact on her health, finances, relationships, employment, legal issues. Your awareness may be based on personal observations or credible statements by the child or young person or another person. Now, let's think about this. Our first decision is, do we answer yes to this? Because if we don't answer yes to this first part of the question, then we don't need to worry about these other ones. So, can we say that we reasonably suspect that Elena is using drugs to the extent that it's having a negative impact on her health? Well, we don't really know that. What we did see is that she had some slow movements in speech. Her eyes were closing. Her head was nodding, and she was losing track of conversations. And she looked a bit disoriented when she, came out of having had her eyes closed. The reality is that we don't really know that it's having a negative impact on her health. We're not doctors. We don't have a doctor's report. We don't have a nurse in the community centre that can say to us, look, her blood results are showing this, so we don't really have that much information. This is what I was saying before about being really careful not to assume information from what you have, and really pulling apart the information that you actually have in the case study as opposed to what you think what you're seeing might relate to. Okay, so we can't say that it's having a negative impact on her health. We certainly don't know that it's having an impact on her finances, her relationships, her employment, or her legal issues. Now, you might say, well, you know what? She's come into the centre to ask for some food vouchers, so there are some financial issues going on. But we don't know that it's her drug use that's causing the financial issues. It might be that she's lost her job. It might be that because of a particular change in circumstances, her income has gone down. So this is really important. We can't answer yes to this question because we can't reasonably suspect that her drug use is negatively impacting her health, her finances, her relationships, her employment, or causing any legal issues. Okay, so we cannot answer yes, so therefore we're going to answer no. If we had answered yes to this question, if we had more information that led us to believe that these things were being impacted, we would have to answer yes to this part and yes to one of the following. Because we're answering no, we don't have to worry about the rest. So we're going to select no for this one. And we're going next. The next question is asking you about, whether you have any other concerns. This one, says the answers you've just provided about that first question have been about your most serious concerns. Do you have any other concerns about the safety, welfare, or well-being of the child or young person? So if you read the definition, we can see that if we answer yes, it means we have other concerns about the safety, welfare, well-being of Harry. So in this case, we do have other concerns. We have concerns that Elena is probably using an excessive amount of her pain medication, which is making her drowsy, disoriented, slowing her speech and mannerisms. We've got concerns that maybe if this is happening when Elena's home with Harry, that she might not be able to meet his needs, whether they be his physical needs or his psychological needs. So here we're saying, yes, we have other concerns. Now, an important point to remember is that if you're answering yes here, it's not going to impact on the eventual end MRG decision. This is so that you have the information here as other concerns to provide to the Child Protection Helpline if you have to make a report. This is important for things like cumulative harm, which just means if you've had a number of different concerns about a child over a period of time where it hasn't met the threshold for reporting, you can put it together and say, look, this has been going on for a while. That's an example of cumulative harm. So it's really important to document these kinds of things when you have them. So we're saying, yes, we have other concerns. And I have written something here. So I'm just going to copy and paste that in so that you can see what that looks like. So we do have some additional concerns that we know Elena to have a drug problem. We've witnessed her under what we believe to be the influence of drugs. We've got concerns that she's probably using an excessive amount of her pain meds, and that, you know, the impacts of that is that it makes her drowsy, disoriented. And we're concerned, as I said before, that if this is happening when she's with Harry, that she may or may not be able to meet his physical or psychological needs. Okay, so we've documented that there. We're clicking next. Now this part is really interesting. It usually catches a few people out. It asks us whether we have concerns about a class of children or young people. So it says the answers that you've just provided have been about your concern for an individual child, for Harry. Do you have concerns about the safety, welfare, or well-being of a class of children or young people? Now, if we go to the definition, what we'll see is if we have concerns about a group of children who are impacted by the same kind of abuse or concern that we're reporting. All right, so an example of this is, say, for example, you're reporting a child that's disclosed they'd been sexually abused by a teacher, and that teacher had access to a group of other children, whether it be the class or the year group or the school group, then this is where you'd say yes to that question. So in cases like this, it ensures that even if you don't have the individual names of each of the children that may have been exposed to this person or that may have been sexually abused by the teacher, you have enough concerns about the fact that he has sexually abused a student to make a class of children report. So in this case, it's not the case. We're only concerned about Elena and her son Harry. So we're saying no here. What we see here is then this takes us to the final MRG decision report. In this case, we only answered 3 questions. So in other reports, what you might find is that if you select yes, for example, to the first question where we selected no, you'll have a lot more questions to answer, and it can differ depending on the concerns that you have. So this MRG decision page is really important. It gives you lots of really useful information. It gives you the outcome of the MRG, and the outcome here is to document and continue the relationship and monitor. So we're maintaining our relationship with the child and the family as far as appropriate and possible. Then it gives you the reason why we've come to this. And we get this because there is no suspected significant risk of harm, but the family may benefit from your continued support or service, because this can then help to mitigate or prevent an escalation of harm. The really important thing here is to remember that when you get this outcome, and we'll talk about the other outcomes in a minute, this does mean that you have not met the threshold for reporting, because if you did, it would say either report to the helpline or immediately report to the helpline. What this tells you then is what you should do. You should support the child yourself within your role in your organisation. You can find other support services for the child or their family if this is out of your scope in terms of the work that you're doing. You can exchange information with other practitioners working with the child to better build a picture of any risk and support factors. So for example, for Harry, if you knew that he was working or seeing the school counsellor, you are able to, under this legislation, to make contact with the school counsellor and have a chat to him or her about how things are going with Harry to build up a better picture. You should also document your client contact. Okay. Further down the page, it gives you lots of really great links in terms of supports, resources to help you support the child or young person. You know, how might you exchange that information with the school? There's some practice guides and there's some risk-specific practice support around concerns that you might have. There's a really good summary then of your MRG answers. So your main concern was the carer concern, and this is a little paragraph that summarizes all the yes no's that you've given. So what we've said is that the parent's substance abuse does not impact, or it's not likely to impact on her ability to meet the child's needs, cause significant harm, or the child or young person's behaviour doesn't indicate the impact of the parent's substance abuse. Now, as we know, this can change, but for the minute, for the information that we have at the moment, this is the outcome that we have. Then what you'll see here is the additional concerns that I copied and pasted in. So these will come up on your decision report. Importantly, if you do get an outcome of document and continue relationship, or another outcome which I'll show you in a minute, which means that you're not reporting to the helpline, agencies and mandatory reporters have the responsibility to document this contact in your records and to keep it. And a good way of doing that is to generate a PDF from this decision report. So what you'll see is it will download an MRG outcome PDF, and it presents it in a neat little PDF form that you can print out. You can fill in your name here. It auto-populates the date that you've completed it. And for your records or for your files at work, you can document the child's name here, the mother's name, and it's got all the information about the outcome. That goes in files, and then should you need to look at that at another time, or for example use that on the basis of making another report later on, you've got that in your files. Okay, we're just going to come out of this and go back into the rest of the presentation. So I hope that demonstration of the MRG was useful. I know it's a little bit long, but I think that it's worth going through at least one full example so that you then know how to use the tree in any other situation. So what we saw in that case study was that the outcome was document and continue relationship. What we know from this is that we don't need to make a report to the Child Protection Helpline because the concerns that we have for Harry don't meet the reporting threshold for a report of risk of significant harm. The outcome of the MRG was that it was non-ROSH. So we know that because there are 4 different MRG outcomes. 2 of these relate to reporting to the helpline, and the remaining 2 are for non-ROSH concerns with suggestions about where to turn to from here if you're a service provider. So firstly, we have, in terms of the MRG outcomes, we have the immediate report to the Child Protection Helpline, which is the most urgent outcome. This means that we've obviously met the ROSH threshold and we need to immediately send an e-report or call the helpline to make a report. Now, the helpline is currently saying that their preference is for e-reporting because they are being assessed by team managers very, very quickly and within the hour, as opposed to the phone calls. The next type of outcome that you can get that's also ROSH is reporting to the Child Protection Helpline, the second section here in green, where this is, yes, it's a report, but it's not an urgent one. You have to do it within 24 hours by e-report preferably. The last 2 outcomes of the MRG is one that we saw, which is document and continue relationship and monitor. This means that it's non-ROSH. We can't generate a report via the e-report system because it's non-ROSH, but you should be documenting your concerns, continuing the relationship and monitoring the situation. The final outcome that we didn't see today, which is also non-ROSH, is to consult with a professional service or make a referral. And what that means is that you should engage with a local support agency to make sure that the child's needs are being addressed and that the concerns don't escalate further. So if you feel that your service isn't able to provide the support in terms of perhaps, in this example, Elena's drug use, you'd be looking at making a referral to another service. So that brings us to the end of our webinar on the MRG. Here is a list of resources with links that you can go to for more information. We'll also provide you this presentation in PDF so that these links will be live and you can go straight to them. Thank you for joining me in this webinar about the Mandatory Reporter Guide. I hope it's been helpful and I hope that it will help you to understand what the MRG is and also how to use it as part of your assignments when you need to, but also as part of your future work in community services. If you do have any other questions about using the MRG or about an assignment that asks you to use the MRG and your questions haven't been answered in the webinar, please contact the teaching section. We're available Monday to Friday, 8:30 to 5 p.m. via email at tafedigital.comserve@tafensw.edu.au and via phone on 9715 8299. We also have some teachers in the office on a Wednesday evening up until 8 p.m. And they're available for you as well to talk through whatever it is that you need. So thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure to go through the MRG with you. I wish you all the best in your studies.